Welcome everyone from Victoria, British Columbia. We're on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish First Nation, and we're honoured to share that territory with them. So the purpose of this hour's conversation is to talk to people about what we've done on the central coast of British Columbia in terms of transitioning it from an area that was managed unsustainably, both for natural resources and for the Indigenous populations of the coast, and transition it into an area that is on its way towards more sustainable management through natural resource management based on nature's principles and working in concert with the Indigenous First Nations in a joint decision-making model of resource development. So I'm going to introduce myself and then introduce my two colleagues to give you a little bit of background. So my name is John O'Riordan. The reason why I'm involved in the Central Coast, because I was between 2000 and 2004, I was Deputy Minister in the BC Provincial Government Ministry called the Sustainable Natural Resources Ministry. And part of my mandate was to develop and complete a land use plan for the Central Coast. In a minute or two, I'll show you a map of where the Central Coast is, but it effectively is the whole coast from the north end of Vancouver Island up to the Alaska border and over to Haida Gwaii offshore. And it's very important because it is an area that has probably the last largely intact temperate rainforest in the world. And it became a World Heritage Site for protection. So when I joined the file in 2000 as Deputy Minister, we were in conflict. There was a market campaign by the Enviros to try and limit the amount of logs taken from parts of the Central Coast into the retail market. And so they were successful in basically clamping down most of the market for the logs coming out of the coast. And when the new government came in 2001, they were faced with a dilemma of either finding a solution that involved the Enviros, the forest companies, the First Nations and government in a joined approach to managing the coast sustainably, or to continue to have a disruptive market campaign. Everybody agreed to lower the gloves. Everybody agreed to get together and try and make this work, even my friend Dallas Smith. And we then embarked on a grand journey, which started in 2000 and is still continuing 20 years later in 2020. So my role was to advise Cabinet directly on the land use plan and to help forge a consensus on how we want to manage the natural resources of this wonderful part of the coast. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my good friend Dallas Smith to introduce himself in 2 or 3 minutes. Not easy for Dallas Smith, but I'm going to give him the best shot at it.
Thanks a lot, John. I actually started talking 2 minutes ago, but you had me muted, so I'll still hit my 7-minute intro that I'm used to. Galikasa, Gigame, Kahinu. Just like to thank the chiefs for whose land I'm on right now, which is up in Campbell River, halfway up Vancouver Island. And introduce myself. My name is Dallas Smith. I'm a president of a group called Nanwokolas Council, and I'm one of the few First Nations leader, industry user, environmentalist, government person who was at day one of the Great Bear Rainforest right through to today, where we're still working on implementation values. We wrote up a really beautiful plan that's going to change the world and make it a better place to live, but implementation has proven to be a little trickier than we thought, even though we got everybody to agree to a land use regime going forward, or multiple land use regimes going forward. It's quite challenging to try to implement it with the diversities that exist on the coast of British Columbia and the challenges that face us with climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So as First Nations groups, we've learned to build regional organizations to help us sort of just stay on top of everything as it goes forward. So it's a pleasure to participate and help try to bring some perspective to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dallas. And that's the reason for the webinar. We're going to tell stories of what works, what doesn't work, and what still has to be done. My other colleague on this webinar is my good friend Wally Emer, who was actually a staff person with me back in 2000, learned all the good things in life. Everything that's good, Wally knows, and everything that's bad he got from Dallas. So, Wally, over to you. What's your role in this great adventure?
I was going to say, I did say, anyone who can survive almost 20 years with you two must be doing a lot wrong, probably. But anyways, hi, I'm Wally Eamer. In the context of ecosystem-based management and what we now call the Great Bear Rainforest, I joined, with John's invitation, I joined in May 2002. I remember after about 2 weeks thinking, everyone's been involved in this for several years. How in heck do I add any value? And now here we are when I'm part of the old guard. I left the provincial government in February 2006 and began working for Nanwokolas, what's now Nanwokolas, Dallas's, or the organization Dallas heads, and worked more or less full-time through to 2014 when I took a year off with my wife and went traveling, and have really, and when I came back, decided it was time for another generation in terms of full-time work. I am still involved to some extent, including being a director on Coast Funds, which we'll talk about in a little while. And just to show what an odd world it is, in late 2008, I think it was, I was ordained as a deacon in the Anglican Church. So actually, I was an ordained minister while working for Dallas's organization, and still am. That's the links there are just that part of the magic, if you wish, of putting something large together like this is how do you mesh different people? Not how do you become all the same, but how do you mesh different people?
So I'm going to go on to a screen share in a minute, but before I do, I just wanted to talk about my legacy project in my dear wife's name called the Climate and the Arts. It's a project in Gail O'Riordan's name, who unfortunately passed a couple of years ago. And she had 4 principles that she left with me. She wanted a legacy that bolstered living within nature's limits and within our own limits. She wanted to make sure that our self-interest was aligned with the planetary interest and not too self-centered. She wanted to make sure that we had a spirituality that touched upon the universe and that we retained direct links with the spiritual world. And she wanted an economic base that was kinder, gentler, and more compassionate. Fairly easy legacy to follow, but a very humbling one for myself. And these are the principles around which we are sharing this story as we walk through the Great Bear Rainforest. So I'm going to screen share right now. We're going to walk you through a story over the next hour of how we moved. So this is where the Great Bear Rainforest is. It's draped along the coast of British Columbia. So you'll see Vancouver Island at the south end of the map, and Victoria is at the bottom end of south of Vancouver Island. And then this is the Alaska border. So this whole area is the Great Bear Rainforest, and it includes Haida Gwaii, though largely we're talking about the coastal part of the Great Bear Rainforest. I just want to walk you through 2 points on the map. One is, what did we inherit in 2000? And what do we got right now in 2020? And I'm going to ask Dallas and Wally to help me through this. So in 2000, as I mentioned, we had disruption caused by environmentalists trying to block the market share for the companies. And we had a governance model that was led solely by the province. It's the landowner of all of the land. In British Columbia, all land is owned by the Crown. Almost all land is owned by the Crown. Certainly almost all of this Central Coast is owned by the Crown. So the government is the landowner of all the forests and the waters and the fish and the wildlife and everything else on the land. And there was very much an economy based on unsustainable practices on forestry and fisheries. And so, Dallas, I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to 2000 and what was the plight of your people in your Indigenous communities that you inherited before we started on the planning process?
Yeah, thanks, John. It was challenging times. We had seen the really final starting of the collapse of the fishing industry, which employed most of our people seasonally. Forestry was a go-to for some of the guys during the off-season in fishing, but we were really finding challenging times, and high unemployment brought high social problems in our community. So our level of human well-being was already challenged, but as these resource-based industries started to fluctuate and falter, an already challenging situation became dire. And that helped us open our eyes to realize that any solution that was going to come from the previous 5 years of land use planning that we had been a part of had to have that balance between our cultural health and well-being, economic health, and ecological health. And that was really the start of EBM, was making that third leg of the stool. Traditionally, government initiatives only took the economy and the environment into consideration, but that's what makes the Great Bear different, is we added that third leg to the stool. So it was, looking back in time, that was definitely a turning point in the early 2000s when we took this on.
Thanks, Dallas. And so as you'll see from this slide, less than 10% of the land base at that time was protected from forest activity. We've talked about the loss of natural capital, and First Nations really had no major role in decision making. So we now cut forward 20 years and to tell us where we are now. So Dallas, let's talk about the current shared decision making model that operates on the coast and how that's changed from where you were 20 years ago.
Definitely, we've seen a dramatic increase in the inclusion of First Nations into the decision-making process. I'd like to say we've gone as far as to say we're jointly making decisions, but that's not quite the matter yet. While we've won certain court cases that have helped move the effort forward, we've still been able to work very closely with government on decisions that we agree with, but don't have that, and veto is not the word I'm looking for, but we don't have that ability to disagree. Government still has the final say at the end of the day, unless we want to challenge that in the courts. So we've had to learn to make better use of common tables to help inform government's decisions and help government make better decisions, which is finally starting to happen over the last 5 or 6 years. It's been, it's only when you can look back to where we were in 2000 to where we are now, where we have these vast swaths of protected area that we actually have a say in. We've developed the co-management plans for these conservation areas. That was one of the things that we used Wally Emer for when we seconded him from your staff, John, was to help us actually build these plans so they are workable plans that our communities could understand and engage with.
Thanks, Dallas. So Wally, let's talk about how much the land is conserved now, and what is meant by ecosystem-based forestry?
Let's start off with what does it mean conservation, because a lot of the confusion with numbers comes from different people defining that word in different ways. The main impact, human impact on the ecosystems of the Great Bear Rainforest is forestry, and I would also argue fishing, but we're focused on the terrestrial right now. And there's another story in the ocean that Dallas is very knowledgeable about. Where we started back in the year 2000 or 2002 for that matter, when I joined on, is that forestry, and that will be my focus, and mining was allowed over 90% of the land base. Now, in most of the land base, some areas there were no trees, and other areas those trees were small and very expensive. The mines were a long way away from transportation, etc. So perhaps nothing was happening, but it could happen. And we are now into, and that, I think, especially amongst the people who live in and around the Great Bear Rainforest, that risk was a major cause of dissatisfaction. And where we have come to is that, and I'll talk to forestry, rather than being allowed to log anywhere except in a park or maybe in a thin strip along salmon bearing rivers, and streams. Now you're only allowed to log on approximately 500,000 hectares. And there is a bunch of work that has been done, and actually I'd say quality work that involved both the companies, environmentalists, First Nations, and provincial government, to say, given that we don't want to have logging happening in cultural sites, given that it can't happen around the immediately adjacent to salmon-bearing streams, etc., where would that logging ideally be so that it's commercially profitable? Because those who have access to the land need to make money on it, or else it doesn't happen and there's no jobs, which no jobs and the social side starts to fall apart. So we've gone from you can go anywhere to you can go into these areas that don't impact prime other values.
So, Wally, sorry,
okay.
your 500,000 hectares is what? What's the total area of the coastal land base?
It's under 15%. So that's why we say we have conservation of about 85% of the land base.
Yeah, and we still have an economy.
And we still have an economy there, and most of the economically accessible forest, and what we now call the working forest, is actually in the south end of the Great Bear Rainforest, and the significant parts of that are on the territories of the traditional territories of the nations in Nanwokolas. That's where the forest is higher quality, it's easier to access, and therefore more of it is financially sustainable. Mining is a little bit of a different story, but and so if you look here, you'll see on this map, the dark green areas are now called conservancies or parks. Conservancies is the modern and better term. Certainly no logging there, but in lots of other areas, there's no logging because of what we call landscape level planning, because it's outside that 500,000 hectares. And if it ain't in the 500,000 hectares, you can't go there. And if you were to argue that, well, I should go there and I want to go there, there would be a long process to take land out of the 500,000 hectares and transfer those hectares over to where you're arguing it should be. So it's not easily done. I think that's enough, unless you want more.
No, that's fine. Dallas, I'm going to roughly show the area that your group of First Nations is around this area. Is that right?
Yes.
And can you tell us a bit about them? How many bands there are, what the population is, and what's the resource base?
In the area that I'm working for, representing right now, there's 6 different First Nations, 5 of whom were within my council, and another one we do work for, representing about 5,500 people who generally live in the Campbell River and Northern Island area.
Okay, good. So I'm going to move on here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about how we constructed the plan. What was the resource information that we used? So maybe, Wally, you can talk about the Coast Information Team and some of the values that they brought into the planning process.
Sure. The planning process did a number of really smart things, and John had a big role in this. And one was to commit to use science. Now, the difficulty is science is a process of determining truth. It's not, there's not a book that has science that says this is science and all the other books are false. But we did commit to use science. The other difficulty was often the questions we were using were leading, or I call them bleeding edge questions. And the scientifically based knowledge that would give definitive answers frequently didn't exist. So the Coast Information Team, which was funded by governments in the forest sector and the environmentalists, to their eternal credit, worked to bring forward in a unitary way what is the science that we have in this area. And in some cases, they commissioned new studies to try and, where there were important questions that science, where there was not yet any science, they tried to bring science forward. That was important. It was still difficult because in many cases, the scientific information wasn't complete enough to give absolutely definitive answers. And we will always, if you're ambitious, you will always be asking questions for which there have not yet been answers, which often means if the questions are new, no one has gone through the scientific process to try and find the information necessary to answer those questions.
So I'm just about in for a sec here because I wanted to point out that the information was based on three vectors. One was on the ecology and the environment. The second was on the economic opportunities in forestry, mining, etc. But the third was on social well-being, the nature of the community and how the community was bound together. So Dallas, can you talk about, that was a more difficult one to quantify, as I recall, when we were putting together the information. What was your experience of the social well-being side of things?
Yeah, thanks, John. When I was sitting at the Coast Information Team, sort of as the First Nations representative to bring information forward, we knew what our interaction with the forestry industry was. We knew what our interaction for conservation values were, but we weren't sure how to measure our culture or whether it was healthy. What was our human well-being? Did it mean everybody had jobs and had a good car and all those sorts of things that common metrics were taken by? Or was there more to it than that? And that's where we started to realize that First Nations human and social well-being was very far down on the scales that were used in the human well-being of nations that the United Nations uses and things like that. So we realized that even though we had running water, we had some housing, we had things like that, we still lived in third world conditions when we measured ourselves up against the other things that other modernized or developed countries take for granted. And this was happening in Canada, where there's a very high level of human well-being. So that was really a challenge, was trying to find the right metrics to not counter, but to help blend in with the ecological and economic information. And that was a huge undertaking that, to be honest with you, if we ever had a redo, we would know how to tackle that question a lot better. That's something that we learned, that it was just something we took for granted, but because it never had a direct economic impact or a direct ecological impact, it was just something that's been overlooked for the 30, 40 years that countries have been gathering this kind of data.
Still a work in progress, I think, too.
Definitely.
So let's talk about the EBM principles were more than environmentals. So maybe, Wally, you can talk about these are the principles that underpinned all of the planning process.
Actually, John, I would prefer Dallas to start on this one because he's the one who had to engage these and engage them in a way that he could speak to his community and speak on behalf of his community. So do you mind if I ask Dallas to lead this?
No, I thought I was waiting Dallas out, but I'm fine if he wants to have a go at this. It's fine.
He's a lot tougher than that. He doesn't wear out easily.
No, 20 years of the Great Bear hasn't gotten me down. So as long as I can have a good glass of red wine tonight, I'll hunker down, boys. EBM was a different concept to talk to our communities about. Our communities understood that people used our lands and resources and they profited from them. They realized that a lot of it wasn't sustainable, but a lot of our people were starting to get jobs in the forest industry and things like that. And so it was very hard to try build our own stand on what we thought our principles should be. In the beginning of the process, we just deferred to either the Ango position or the forestry position and never really developed our own for our first few years. I used to use the analogy that it was like we were kids caught in a divorce sometimes, that we felt that we were in a bit of a tug of war between industry and the environmentalists, till it got to a point where we almost kind of did the Three Stooges, knocked their heads together and said, okay, this is what we feel needs to be part of this discussion. Our cultural connection to our lands and resources has to be paramount with the extraction or protection of them. We need to have that as an even footing place. So introducing that almost became timely, where we started to take control of our own destinies a little bit more, and we used the planning processes that both the environmental organizations and the forest companies used. We almost used their own information against them to show how we were falling out. We were the crumb that fell through the grate all the time. And that was really a learning movement for First Nations up on down the coast, that we needed to play a larger role in how decisions were made when it came to the development or protections of lands and resources. With that said, then we had to hire consultants to help illustrate that and put that into numbers and words, because Western science and philosophy and all that colonialism stuff doesn't take how important a cultural connection is into consideration. So we had to find ways to provide metrics for that. And that's why we needed to have people like Wally Emer, and we had to get the people, the ear of government people like yourself, John, who started to realize that First Nations needed to be given some capacity to be able to properly play in this game, to make it work and to make it last.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the great learning processes was the understanding the Indigenous culture and how you brought that culture into the decision-making process. But just quickly to walk through, the principles are based on living within nature's limits, ecological integrity, being just to society, human well-being, that people were kind and just and caring, dealing with the precautionary principle that if we didn't know something, we didn't stumble into doing something that might cause problems down the road. And most important, having government-to-government decision-making, so that there was a genuine shared decision-making model where both parties made best efforts to come to a consensus on all of the major decisions on the plan. And finally, which we'll talk about later, the need to reconcile, because in Canada, we have embedded Aboriginal rights and title in our constitution. And the only way to clarify these is to have a reconciliation process, which involves our government, other stakeholders, and the Indigenous people coming together and coming to an agreement on how that title should be allocated. So I'm going to fairly quickly go through this, Wally, but I know you were involved in the landscape level, which is the sort of more granular level of how we tried to define exactly what kind of forest practices would take place in each of these little watersheds. But maybe you don't bore us with all the details, but just talk about how this helped to flush out the overall plan.
Sure. In many ways, I tried to make it simple. And in simple terms, it was this. There's going to be a lot of conservation. There must be protection of First Nations cultural sites, some of which, by the way, are secret within families. They're not even known to everyone in the nation, let alone outsiders. And there's good reasons for that, because often when the information was known, the sites were desecrated. But if you're not going to be there, then industry needed to tell us, well, where are the places where the wood is most valuable? And that's not crass, that's practical, because if there are jobs in forestry, we want the jobs to be safe and we want them to be well paid, which means the wood needs to be high quality, high value wood, ideally readily accessible, or at least relatively accessible. And so we literally went with maps, and I would sit down with people from the nation and lay out where were the important cultural sites, etc. And it's interesting because the companies accepted, and this is where building trust is so important, the companies accepted that if I, on behalf of the nation, said this area was culturally important, I would not tell them why. But they accepted it. And I wouldn't tell them why, because if I said that's where this site is or that site is, then that makes it open, that puts it at risk. And it was in the company's interest, because they didn't want to spend a bunch of money planning to go into some area and then have that money wasted because it was going into, let's say, an important spiritual site that they didn't know anything about. And it was interesting. The companies knew quite a bit about where the important First Nation areas were just by practice over time. The province knew where a lot of it was, but only the nation knew where all of it was. And so there was a significant amount of trust that if the nation said no, then government and the companies accepted that no. And we looked elsewhere.
Yeah, but I think it was a huge exercise to go down to that level of planning at the watershed level, but it was very beneficial. that in the end of the day, you knew that you were protecting the key areas and that overall the eco-based system principles would apply across the landscape.
Yeah, and this was done in two different waves, if I could. The first wave, there was less of a conservation budget available. So some of the areas that were of culturally important to First Nations for food gathering, let's say, or other issues, we weren't able to protect because the number of hectares we could protect, there were more higher priority issues.
Mm.
But now, with 85% of the land off limits to commercial logging, that's much less of a problem. The second wave had a larger budget. It's almost as if you're making clothes and you get more cloth. So if you're trying to prevent sunburn, more cloth gives you better outcomes.
So form follows function, and because the function had changed, we moved from a non-eco-based system model before 2000 to one fully embedded in ecosystem principles of natural resource management and well-being. Then the governance model had to change because the functions had changed. So the two principal ones were on the shared decision-making forum. There was a policy forum at the highest level to make all the major decisions. And Dallas, I'm going to, because you're a member of the policy forum, I believe, for your Indigenous group. And do we still have the single window to help manage all the referrals that come through onto the land base?
I'm happy to say that we do. While we've gone through a couple different premiers, a couple different governing parties, we've managed to keep the framework that we developed that help us be successful. So the forum consists of technical, bureaucratic, and political levels. So we've learned that stuff should go through both of our sides of the technicians. What they can't solve goes to the middle bureaucrats, and what the bureaucrats can't solve go to the ministers, deputy ministers, chiefs representatives. And we found that instead of just trying to problem solve shooting from the hip, solutions have to work their way up through the governance process. And good governance is good governance, no matter what partisan take, whether you're socialist, economist, capitalist. If you have a structure in place that has all the information necessary and all the people funneling into it, each government has decided to keep it. So we're happy to say that that's been sort of a legacy of the Great Bear Rainforest. And yes, we still do have the single window approach for all the referrals, so we don't run into the silo mentality where everybody stays in their silo, whether you're forestry, fisheries, protection. Our governance system now takes it all into consideration through a single window approach, and we're still working with government under that basis. So it's been nice to see that has standed the test of time.
Alice, could I add something here? And this is important from the perspective of the economic entities, be it the forest companies, the miners, or others, the recreation people looking for government approval. A lot of the territory here is within the territory of two or more nations. And so when you have a single portal like Nanwokolas, where there's two or three nations each, where it would be affecting the territory of two or three nations, Nanwokolas goes and sorts out what it is among their member nations so that there's a single answer. Otherwise, the companies are going to three different nations and negotiating with three different nations and then trying to bring it together in a way that works for everybody. This puts more authority and more responsibility with the First Nations organization. The people in the companies preferred it. And they kept asking me, is there any way that nations aren't part of Nanwokolas can join this, because it made it easier for them. And I think probably easier for the province. So some of these things are win-win. Some of these things work in ways that we didn't first understand, and they're powerful for that.
Yeah, well, I think they're creative solutions to the way we're dealing with these problems. So, Dallas, your First Nations got direct access to timber, I believe, in some part of the development of the plan and post-plan. So what's the story there between what you folks own and how you work with companies? And
definitely, one of the challenges we always had was we kept getting either caught, like I said before, reacting to what the other entities wanted. And we made it clear to the government and the forest companies that if you want us to help protect your jobs and your economy that we're only sharing a minor subset in, you have to give us some skin in the game. So now we've opened up to different kinds of partnerships, and it's still a work in progress, mind you, but now the companies are working together with First Nations to take the limited opportunities we have and maximize their potential. But because we're creating partnerships, we're creating some certainty on the land base. So like Wally was alluding to, we know where we can't go, so we don't bother wasting the money trying, and we focus on the opportunities that are in front of us. Which is a challenge now with climate change and other things that are going on. We have to make sure that every tree we cut has the right ecological support behind it, but also that we maximize the opportunity that comes from any development in our resources to make sure that we keep that even keel as much as we can. Mm-hmm. So I think you'll see this trend grow, and you're seeing other nations in other parts of British Columbia learn from these cooperative models where they're building more partnerships. Now you'll see the Huayet on the west coast of British Columbia now own 7% of the tenure in their territory. So they work with Western Forest Products on that, and that's going to evolve to a bigger piece every year as they go forward. So we're learning how to build these partnerships that create the certainty to the economic and social well-being our communities need.
So I should say at this point that if people are interested in finding out more about the Great Bear Rainforest, there are a couple of websites that Jake's going to post in the chat box. One on the government's overall website on the history of the Great Bear Rainforest, some of the current initiatives. And you're also going to post one on the Coast Funds Board, which is the funding mechanism to help implement the plan. I'm going to ask Wally to talk about the Coast Funds Board, because I think you've been a member of that board and maybe still a member.
Yeah, I am. I think I joined in 2013. Actually, Merv Child, who is the executive director, I think, is that the right term, official term, Dallas, of Nanwokolas, served as a board member for 12 years and was chair for well over half of that. There was part of what brought this together was the provincial and federal governments together made a financial commitment of $60 million, and environmentalist groups raised another $60 million, and that money was to go towards the conservation. The $60 million was for conservation in the Great Bear Rainforest, as managed and in the interests of First Nations, and also economic development as managed and for the First Nations. Now, if that seems slightly unfair, almost all of the population, with the exception of Prince Rupert, all the population in the Great Bear Rainforest, the small communities, are Indigenous communities primarily. And so this money is available. It's a little different in that the board is responsible to manage the money under the terms set by the funders, by the two governments, and by the environmental fund and by the environmental groups. And we distribute the money to the First Nations upon approved projects. I would say nowadays the nations would prefer a model where the money goes directly to them, that it's not held by another entity. But that said, this has worked, I think, quite well. The nations seem to think that this has worked well, even if it's slightly suboptimal in that the money doesn't go directly to them. The conservation money is there in perpetuity, so we're spending the interest. The economic money was meant to be fully spent out in 7 years. It's probably going to take closer to about 17 years to pay it fully out, because we have to be careful the money is going into good projects. And business conditions on in the Great Bear Rainforest, in many cases for First Nations, it's a difficult place to do business. It's expensive. It's interesting, but I think tourism is actually, especially with COVID, tourism is basically shut down this year, and that the big tourist draw back in the early 2000s was fishing, especially salmon fishing with lodges. Most of those have gone out of business. A lot of them. And so it's hard work, and but it's successful work. Can I tell a little story, John? It'd take about 2 minutes.
You can always tell a story. That's what.
I always can. That's why I have to ask permission.
No.
About 2 years ago, I was in the territory of one of the member nations coast funds, not one of Dallas's, the nations in Dallas's organization. And he had been a counselor when I had been up there as negotiator back in about 2004 or 5. And he was chief now, and I was in a reflective mood, and the two of us were standing at the rail of a new youth center that was going to open in literally within a couple of weeks. And I asked him, has anything really changed in the roughly 15 years since you and I first met? And he thought for a minute and said, yeah, it has. 15 years ago, there was over 90% unemployment for people on the reserve. Now it's 60% unemployment. So does that mean they're in a perfect world? No, it doesn't. But it does mean things have got better. And more important, there is a sense that things are getting better. And that gives hope. And that makes a difference to how you live your life. And the youth center that they were building was for their nation, the youth of their nation. But the non-Indigenous people in that area were going to be invited in as well. So as you start to have the wealth and security and cultural protection, people's natural generosity comes out much better because they don't feel like they're besieged. And that has kept me going. And that happened.
So
and that's a good thing.
Can I sum that up, that we lost fear? We now live with hope.
We live with hope, and the reason for that is that there has been real change, and there is now some power. And it makes a difference. If you're living in a community and you think your great-grandchildren will be living in that community, you make different decisions than if you live in Victoria and you're going to earn your living in Knight Inlet for the next 2 years, and then maybe 2 years later, then the next 2 years after that, you'll be a different place altogether, and maybe 10 years from now, you'll be down in Chile. You make different decisions about what is wise when you have a long-term commitment to a part of the planet.
Wonderful, Wally. Dallas, have you got any stories of some of your folk who have benefited by this directly? Have you got anything come to your mind?
Oh, definitely, John. I think the fact that we now are training our own guardians and stewards to monitor the decisions that we're jointly trying to implement. So in the old days, when we first started these planning processes, we always had to trust the ANGO's information or the forestry company information, or God forbid, the government information.
Careful
we've now put ourselves in a position, thanks to building collaborative relationships, that we gather our own information now, and we're able to share that to help make better decisions. And that's something that I didn't think we would see, not necessarily in my lifetime, but we're so far apart on how this beautiful part of the world should be managed that we really didn't see us being at least in the front seat, if not the driver's seat, full time. So it's really been nice preparing for this, to be able to look back 20 years to see how far we've gone, to give us again that hope and that optimism that we can do that much more in the next 40 years, or in the next 20 years, sorry.
Right.
So we're able to think in bigger increments now, where when I first met you, I lived hand to mouth, fiscal year to fiscal year. We just signed an arrangement with the province that goes till 2032 when it comes to carbon management and offset sharing. So we built that long-term vision now, and everybody's been invited to see it.
Well, I know that personally, because when I was deputy minister, I had the power to offer you money, and I did that from year to year. And as soon as the day that I was no longer deputy minister, you said, "Forget it, John, you're no good to me because you can't offer me any more money. I'm just going to move on." But anyway, we've remained friends ever since. So, but I do want to talk about one other innovation that is on the coast, and this is the carbon offset protocol, because the coast allowed a lot of trees to be protected that wouldn't otherwise have been protected. They would have been subject to logging. And under the British Columbia's forest offset protocol, there are ways in which we can measure the amount of carbon that's stored in all of these trees that would otherwise have been lost if we gone to more traditional logging. And this set up with a third-party verification process, a major carbon offset plan, which I believe is in the nature of $1 million or so a year for the coast. And it's a significant component of the funding it's available. So it just shows you that in a natural world, values of trees standing are much more important than the value of trees in 2x4s and in lumber yards. So we've now begun to finally value the entire tree and its contribution to the ecosystem rather than in a very narrow commercial sense. So this carbon offset was done to provide some money for the government, because the government of the day wanted to reduce the greenhouse gases emitted from government buildings. So they bought the carbon offset to pay for any carbon that was unavoidably emitted from buildings through heating systems and the like. The government also set up a cap and trade agreement with California and Quebec. Unfortunately, a subsequent government took that away. So the market for the carbon offsets is somewhat limited, but it's still, they are valuable. And over the years, we've got $25 million of carbon credits sitting, quote, in the bank. So they are credited. And that equates to about 1 million tons of carbon that have been stored over the years. And I just want to ask Dallas to talk a bit about how some of that money is being used to help pay for Indigenous people to do some independent compliance monitoring of what's going on in forests to make sure that we meet the regulatory requirements. Dallas?
Yeah, thanks. Carbon offsets was something that in the beginning we didn't think was going to carry much water or help deliver the mail. Trying to explain it to our community members that we're selling air, and the whole carbon sequestration thing was one thing, but showing that companies were willing to invest to help offset, like the provincial government to offset their carbon needs. There was a price that came with that, and it was important for us to be able to draw some revenue from carbon to show some of our international foundations that we've developed partnerships with to help build our Guardian programs. So now we're training our own officers and officials to go out and collect data, implement land use plans, make sure that culturally modified trees are protected. Any of these cultural values that we hold near and dear to us, we now have our own mechanism to ensure their protection going forward. And the fact that we're able to derive this stuff from carbon offsets and actually put some of our own revenue on the table has made it easier for us to find investment from outside interest to help us keep these programs going while we grow them to their potential. The original idea was for some of the LNG companies that were going to be built in the northern part of British Columbia on the coast, was they were going to buy these offsets to help offset their emissions, and they were going to pay a bit of a premium because, as we all know, the LNG debate and those sorts of things, and we realized that there was a good potential market there. So while we're not selling carbon at the $20 per ton that we were hoping when we developed the program, we're still averaging between $9 to $13 a ton, which adds up to help us pay for some of our ongoing governance needs. So we're not going to government. I don't need to go to you hat in hand as much anymore if you decided to dust off your resume and come back.
But Jake is going to post a website which talks about what are the carbon offsets, how they're being used, and what is meant by the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol in British Columbia. So it's a very useful background. But to me, it's a highly innovative model of governance, and it's brought a lot of benefit to the Central Coast. I'm looking at the time, so we're beginning to wrap up. You won't believe this, Dallas, but we are going to have to wrap up by 2, just in case. But I did want to talk about the Reconciliation Protocol, which is a very foundational document between the government and your group of First Nations. And I think people need to know that in British Columbia, we don't have very many treaties. That most of British Columbia, the vast majority of British Columbia, has no formal treaties established in law. And there was a treaty-making process studied in about 1990, but very few treaties have ever been completed under that. They're very onerous, they're very time-consuming, and they're very complex. So the government shifted towards reconciliation agreements or protocols, which are a way of reconciling with First Nations on a narrower range of issues, but issues relating to natural resources, well-being, and community growth. And we've developed 3 protocols, one for the south area, the Nanwokolas that Dallas was responsible for, one for the central coast, which runs up to Prince Rupert, and one for Haida Gwaii. So maybe, Dallas, you could talk currently about what is, and I'm going to ask Jake to post the current reconciliation agreement that's in place for the Nanwokolas. But Dallas, talk about that. You signed it almost 10 years ago, and talk about how it's now being updated and what it's meant to you and your First Nation.
Well, definitely, we had seen ourselves that treaty making was very complex, and it wasn't the nations that had negotiated treaties weren't dealing with the complexities of land use management that we were. But at the same time, we realized that we had to find a way to make revenue sharing possible. We couldn't just be, as First Nations people, we couldn't be the only ones dealing with the effect of resource development. We needed to be part of the profit side of that model. And so we sat down with the provincial government and negotiated the first reconciliation protocol. And then then the Haidas did, then the North Coast did. But there's probably 57 different versions of these agreements now that started in the Great Bear Rainforest, where we talk about revenue sharing in a pre-treaty context. We talk about decision making in a pre-treaty context. But one of the new things that we've done is we're now negotiating our Reconciliation Protocol 2.0. We're taking the new UNDRIPA legislation that the province announced, Bill 25, and Canada's commitment to the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we're taking some of that free and prior conformed consent language and trying to apply it into an existing mechanism so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so that's an exciting thing that we're doing right now, is taking a framework that we developed and taking some new societal norms, if you will, and applying them into the existing process so we don't lose out on the opportunities to keep building certainty on the land base. So we still make sure we protect what needs to be protected. We develop what we jointly agree to develop, but now we're jointly agreeing on how the profit sharing and the management and implementation and accountability that comes with making those decisions go in place. So it's an exciting time right now, and the Great Bear Rainforest was in such a global fishbowl because of being the last intact rainforest that we've really been able to use that to hold any government's feet to the fire to show them why, how, and when they can do better. So the reconciliation protocols have been really a good example of taking the lessons we've learned and actually applying them and building some frameworks. So as governments change between First Nations communities, we have elections every 2 years. We go through a lot of governance changes. We have this reconciliation protocol as a foundation of our relationship with the Crown going forward.
Very good, Dallas. So I think it's coming up to 2 o'clock. So I just wanted to thank Wally and Dallas for a wonderful and heartfelt storyline of what we've done on the coast in the last 20 years. It really has been one of the highlights of my career to know that we went from a very dismal place, a lot of distrust, a lot of disruption, a lot of feeling of anger, to something that is still not perfect, but it's so much better than it was before. And it's a base for moving forward with a much greater sense of hope and an accomplishment and a feeling that people are here to stay and work together. And I think the collaboration between government, the First Nations, the communities, the stakeholders, and the companies is, generally speaking, first class, and it's provided a sense of resilience that even if we get across some difficult patches, we seem to find ways in which we will come together.